The courtroom tension. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the county courthouse, casting golden stripes across the polished wooden floor. The building itself carried a heavy silence, the kind that settled deep into the bones of anyone who walked through its doors. It was a silence of judgment, of decisions that could change lives forever, of words that once spoken could not be taken back. Inside courtroom number 4, the air was thick with anticipation. The rows of wooden benches were filled with lawyers in pressed suits, social workers with folders balanced on their laps, families clutching each other's hands, and curious onlookers who had heard whispers of a case that promised to deliver something unusual. They sat waiting, their voices hushed, their eyes fixed on the raised bench at the far end of the room where the judge would soon sit. Malik sat quietly in the front row, his feet barely touching the ground. He was only 9 years old, though the weight in his eyes made him look far older. His dark curls framed a face that carried both innocence and sorrow. He wore a shirt that was too big for him, the sleeves rolled up twice, the fabric stiff from being freshly ironed that morning by his foster mother. Malik's hands clutched the edge of the bench and he swung his feet slowly back and forth, the nervous rhythm betraying his calm posture. On either side of him sat his caseworker, Ms. Jennings, and his current foster parent, Mrs. Miller. They spoke to each other in low tones, occasionally glancing down at him with encouraging smiles. But Malik was too lost in his own thoughts to return them. His mind was on the woman he would see today, the woman whose presence both frightened and comforted him. At the front of the courtroom, the bailiff straightened his tie and announced that court was in session. The heavy door at the side opened and Judge Elena Carter entered. She was a tall woman in her late 40s, her black robe flowing around her like a cloak of authority. Her hair was pinned neatly at the back of her head, and her glasses rested firmly on the bridge of her nose. She walked with a measured pace, not hurried, not hesitant, each step echoing softly against the wooden floor. When she reached her seat, she nodded to the bailiff, and the court rose in unison, the scraping of benches and shuffling of feet breaking the silence. Once seated, Judge Carter glanced down at the docket before her, her sharp eyes scanning the names and details of the case. To those who had appeared before her in the past, she was known as a woman of firm justice, fair but never one to allow emotion to sway her decision. She carried a reputation for her clarity and calm, a judge who listened carefully and spoke decisively. But today was not like other days, and somewhere deep inside her, though she could not name the reason, she felt an unusual stirring. The case before her was a custody matter. A young boy named Malik Johnson, currently under the care of the foster system, was being considered for adoption. Several families had expressed interest in him, but complications had delayed the process. Today's hearing was meant to provide clarity on his placement, to determine whether he would move forward with an adoptive family or remain in temporary care. The details were clear, the paperwork straightforward. Yet when Judge Carter looked down at the boy's name on the file, something faint flickered in her memory, like a shadow of a face glimpsed in a dream. She shook the thought away and adjusted her glasses, focusing on the task at hand. As the proceedings began, the attorneys presented their arguments. One spoke of Malik's resilience, of his good behavior in school, of his gentle nature despite the hardships he had endured. Another spoke of the families eager to give him a home, each with glowing references and stable circumstances. The social worker read reports of Malik's progress, his need for stability, his longing for belonging. The words flowed smoothly, the courtroom nodding along, but Malik sat quietly, his gaze not on the lawyers or the judge, but on the polished wood of the table in front of him. He had been in many courtrooms before, though none felt as important as this one. Something about today felt different, heavier, as if the air itself carried a secret waiting to be revealed. Malik had spent years in the foster system, moving from one home to another, each time packing his small bag of belongings and hoping that maybe this time it would be permanent. But permanence never came. Families tried, but somehow it never lasted. Some were too busy, some too strict, others simply unable to connect with him in the way a child longed for. And so he drifted, house to house, heart to heart, searching for something he could not name but knew he needed. What Malik did not tell anyone was that he often dreamed of a woman's face. It was never entirely clear in his mind, but he felt it deep in his chest, a smile, a voice, a warmth that seemed to belong to someone who was part of him. He had no memory of his real mother, only fragments and feelings, but the dream stayed with him, a whisper in his heart that there was someone out there who belonged to him. He carried that dream like a secret, tucked away in the quiet corners of his mind. As the lawyer spoke, Judge Carter found her gaze drifting toward the boy. She studied him with the careful eyes of someone used to noticing detail. His posture, his stillness, the way he seemed both present and far away. Something about him tugged at her. She brushed the thought aside and returned her attention to the testimony, though a faint unease lingered. When the attorneys finished, the judge leaned forward slightly, her voice calm and measured. "Malik," she said, her tone softening just enough to draw his eyes up. "Would you like to speak?" The room grew still. It was not common for a child to speak directly in such hearings, but sometimes judges allowed it if the child was willing. Malik's caseworker gave him an encouraging nod, and Mrs. Miller patted his shoulder gently. Malik hesitated for a long moment, then stood slowly. His small figure seemed even smaller against the vastness of the courtroom, but his voice, though quiet, carried through the air with surprising clarity. "I don't know if I should," he said, his words careful, his eyes scanning the room. "But I want to." Judge Carter nodded once, her expression unreadable. "Go ahead, Malik, you may speak." The boy drew in a breath, steadying himself. His eyes swept across the rows of faces, the lawyers, the families, the strangers watching. Finally, they landed on the judge herself. He held her gaze for a moment longer than expected, his dark eyes searching, questioning, as if he saw something in her no one else could. "I've been in a lot of homes," Malik began, his voice trembling slightly but growing steadier with each word. "People have been kind to me, and I'm thankful. But it always felt like I was visiting, like I was wearing someone else's shoes that didn't quite fit. I've tried to be good, to smile, to not cause trouble, but still I always ended up leaving. And every time I left, I felt like I was getting further from where I was supposed to be." The courtroom listened in silence, every word sinking in. "I don't remember my mom," Malik continued, his voice soft but carrying. "Not really. But I dream about her. I see her sometimes when I close my eyes. And it feels real, like she's close. I don't know her name, I don't know where she is, but I feel like she's out there, waiting for me." His hands tightened at his sides, his small fist trembling as he spoke. "And today, I don't know why, but when I came in here and saw you, Judge Carter, I felt something. I don't know how to explain it. But I feel like I've seen you before, like I know you." The room froze. A ripple of whispers began at the back, spreading quickly like a wave through the benches. Ms. Jennings straightened in her seat, her eyes wide, while Mrs. Miller placed a hand over her mouth. The attorneys exchanged startled glances, unsure how to respond. Judge Carter sat still, her expression calm but her heart pounding. Something sharp and unexpected struck her chest, and for a moment she could not breathe. She adjusted her glasses, her face betraying nothing, but inside her thoughts raced, and then Malik said it, his voice clear, his eyes locked on hers, his words slicing through the silence. "You're my mom." The gasp that followed filled the entire courtroom. People shifted in their seats, jaws dropped, eyes widened. The bailiff turned sharply, his hand half raised as if unsure what to do. The social worker's folder slipped from her lap, papers scattering across the floor. The families waiting to adopt leaned forward, stunned. And Judge Carter, she gripped the edges of her bench, her knuckles white, her face suddenly pale. The room around her blurred, the voices faded, and for the first time in years she felt the ground beneath her shift. The boys passed. The courtroom had fallen into stunned silence after Malik's words. But deep within that silence, a story had been born, one that stretched back years, long before this boy had stepped into the wooden chamber, long before he had looked at Judge Elena Carter and called her his mother. To understand why those words carried such impossible weight, one had to look beyond the polished benches and gavel, back into the winding, uncertain path of Malik's young life. Malik Johnson's story began not in comfort but in struggle. His earliest years were marked by absence, though he could not remember the details clearly. Like pieces of a puzzle scattered on the floor, his memories were incomplete, fragments of sound and light that never quite fit together. Sometimes late at night he would dream of a lullaby, a soft hum, a warm voice that rose and fell in rhythm with the beating of his heart. At other times he would remember the faint smell of lavender, the kind that clung to clothes when they had been washed with care. But when he woke, the lullaby was gone, the lavender was gone, and all that remained was the stark reality of foster homes and the aching question of who he truly was. By the age of 4, Malik had already been placed in 2 different homes. The first was kind enough but overwhelmed. The couple had 3 children of their own and could not give Malik the attention he needed. He was quiet, well-behaved, but invisible in a house too crowded to notice small shadows. He stayed there a year before being moved again. The second home was stricter, ruled by order and schedules where kindness came in measured doses and affection was rare. Malik learned to adapt. He learned to fold his clothes neatly, to keep his shoes by the door, to speak only when spoken to. But in the silence of his small room, he whispered to the air, hoping someone, somewhere, could hear him. School was another kind of trial. Malik was bright, eager to learn, but the weight of his shifting life followed him like a shadow. Other children came with parents to conferences, to games, to performances. Malik came with caseworkers or temporary guardians. When teachers asked about his family, he smiled politely and said very little. On the playground, some children teased him for not having real parents, words that cut deeper than they knew. Malik did not fight back. Instead, he held his silence like a shield, his eyes betraying the storm inside. Yet despite the difficulties, Malik carried something rare within him, an unshakable gentleness. His teachers noticed it. He was the boy who helped others with their homework, who tied the shoelaces of a smaller child, who shared his lunch when someone forgot theirs. He had a quiet strength that did not come from being loud or demanding, but from holding firm even when life pushed hard against him. In the stillness of his heart, he believed there was more for him, that the emptiness he felt was not permanent but a space waiting to be filled. Through the years, families came and went. Some took him in with good intentions, but life proved too complicated, too heavy, and Malik was moved again. Each time he packed his small bag, clothes folded neatly, a few drawings tucked between them, and always a notebook he carried like a secret treasure. In that notebook, Malik drew faces of people he had never met, faces that seemed to appear in his mind like whispers from a forgotten past. Most of all, he drew one woman's face over and over again. Her features were not always the same. Sometimes her eyes were darker, sometimes lighter, but the feeling was always constant. A warmth, a familiarity, a sense that she belonged to him and he to her. He did not tell anyone about the face. It was his secret, his hope, his invisible thread to a truth he could not yet name. When Malik was 8, he was placed with Mrs. Miller, a woman in her early 60s who had fostered children for years. She was kind but practical. Her love shone more in meals prepared on time and beds made neatly than in words or hugs. Malik appreciated her steadiness. In her home he found a rhythm: school, homework, chores, dinner, bedtime. For the first time in years, he stayed in one place for longer than a few months. But still, the emptiness lingered. Mrs. Miller was caring, but she was not his. She reminded him often that she would not be adopting him permanently, though she would support him until the right family came along. It was during his time with Mrs. Miller that Malik began to understand more about his own history. One afternoon, when she thought he was napping, he overheard her speaking quietly with his caseworker, Ms. Jennings. Their voices drifted through the thin walls, and Malik listened, holding his breath. "He still doesn't know much, does he?" Mrs. Miller asked. "No," Ms. Jennings replied softly. "The records are incomplete. His mother, she was very young. She gave him up when he was only a few months old. It was a closed case and there are few details. The father wasn't listed. For now, all we can do is help Malik find stability with a new family." Malik lay there, his small hands clutching the blanket, his chest rising and falling quickly. He did not understand all the words, but he understood enough. His mother had given him up. The thought cut deeply, yet at the same time a question burned brighter in his heart. Why? Why had she let him go? From that day forward, Malik carried both the ache of abandonment and the stubborn hope of reunion. He told himself that maybe it had not been her choice. Maybe there was a reason beyond what the record said. He clung to the dreams, to the face he drew in his notebook, to the feeling that one day somehow he would find her. As the months passed, Malik's case began moving toward adoption again. Several families had expressed interest and hearings were scheduled to decide his future. Malik attended each one quietly, sitting in courtrooms with his hands folded, listening to strangers discuss where he should belong. The process was confusing, but Malik endured it with patience. Deep down, though, he could not shake the feeling that none of these families were the answer. They were kind, yes, but they did not feel like home. They did not feel like her. Then came the day he first saw Judge Elena Carter. It was during a preliminary hearing, weeks before the one that would shake the courtroom. Malik sat in the same seat, small and silent, when the tall woman in black robes entered. He had seen many judges before, but something about her struck him differently. Her presence filled the room, her voice carried authority, but there was more. When she spoke, Malik felt an odd stirring in his chest, a pull he could not explain. His eyes lingered on her face, studying her features, the shape of her jaw, the curve of her mouth, the way her eyes moved as she read the papers before her. That night, Malik dreamed again of the woman he always drew. Only this time the face was clearer. And when he woke, he realized with a jolt that it was the judge's face he had seen. The days leading to the next hearing were restless. Malik tried to push the thought away, telling himself it was only his imagination, a trick of hope playing with his heart. But the feeling only grew stronger. Each time he thought of the judge, the warmth in his chest returned, the same warmth he felt in his dreams. By the time the next court date arrived, Malik knew he could not stay silent any longer. He would have to speak, no matter what anyone thought, no matter how impossible it sounded. That morning, as he put on the shirt Mrs. Miller had ironed for him, Malik stood before the small mirror in his room. He looked at his reflection, his dark eyes steady, his curls framing his face. "Today," he whispered softly to himself, "I'll tell her." His voice trembled, but there was determination in it. For years he had carried the question of who he was, of where he belonged. Today, in that courtroom, he would finally let his heart speak. And so, when the moment came when Judge Carter looked at him and asked if he wanted to say something, Malik rose. His voice carried not just the words of a boy, but the weight of years of searching, of longing, of hope refusing to die. He told them of the homes he had been in, of the emptiness he felt, of the dreams of a mother he could not remember but could never forget. And then, with eyes locked on the judge, he spoke the truth that had been burning inside him for as long as he could remember. "You're my mom." The gasp that followed was not just the sound of shock. It was the sound of walls breaking, of secrets stirring, of a truth long buried beginning to rise. The judge's secret. The courtroom remained frozen in the echo of Malik's words. But inside Judge Elena Carter's chest, the silence was not calm, it was thunderous. She had built her entire life on steadiness, on logic, on the discipline of separating personal feeling from professional duty. She had spent years hiding her emotions behind a fortress of law and order, and she had succeeded so well that people described her as unshakable. Yet in the space of a heartbeat, a boy had pierced through all of that, speaking words that no one had ever dared say, "You're my mom." For a moment, Judge Carter gripped the edge of her bench, her fingers digging into the polished wood, her face pale though her expression remained carefully composed. The training of years kept her voice steady when she told the bailiff to restore order and asked the attorneys to proceed, but her thoughts had already drifted far from the present. While the lawyers scrambled to recover from the shocking interruption, while the crowd whispered and stared, Elena's mind was pulled backward, to a chapter of her life she had locked away so tightly she had almost convinced herself it never existed. 2 decades earlier, long before the robe, long before the reputation, Elena had been a different woman. She was a law student then, young and ambitious, living in a small apartment and working part-time jobs to support herself. Her dreams of becoming a lawyer had burned brightly, but life had thrown her a storm she had not been prepared for. She had fallen in love, or at least she had believed it was love, with a man who promised her the world but gave her only fleeting affection. The relationship was short-lived, but its consequences were lasting. She had discovered she was pregnant. At first, Elena had tried to be strong. She had told herself she could manage both school and motherhood, that her determination could carry her through. But as the months wore on, reality pressed harder against her fragile resolve. She had no family nearby to help, no financial stability, and no partner willing to stand beside her. Her professors were supportive but firm. Law was demanding, and caring for a child while trying to finish her degree seemed impossible. The whispers of her peers, the raised eyebrows of mentors, The loneliness of nights spent staring at her future, all of it weighed heavily on her. When her son was born, Elena held him in her arms, and for a fleeting moment, all her fears melted away. He was small and fragile, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed too knowing for a newborn. She named him quietly in her heart, though she never dared speak it aloud. For weeks she tried to juggle motherhood and her studies, waking in the middle of the night to feed him, carrying him with her to the library when she could not afford childcare. But exhaustion soon became unbearable, and the fear of failing both as a mother and as a student consumed her. With trembling hands and a heart torn in two, Elena made the most painful decision of her life. She placed her son for adoption. The agency promised her it was the best choice, that he would be given to a family who could love him, support him, give him everything she could not. She signed the papers through a blur of tears, her chest aching with each stroke of the pen. She told herself it was temporary, that perhaps one day she might find him again. But as the months passed, she buried the memory deeper, convincing herself it had been the only way forward. Elena threw herself into her career. She graduated with honors, passed the bar, and rose quickly in the legal world. With each success, she told herself she had done the right thing, that the sacrifice had given her son a better life. Yet in the quiet of her nights, she would sometimes dream of him. A child's laugh echoing through an empty apartment, a pair of dark eyes looking up at her from the corner of her memory. She would wake with her heart pounding, her hands reaching for someone who wasn't there. Those nights always ended the same. Elena staring at the ceiling, whispering apologies into the darkness. Apologies no one could hear. Now as she sat in her courtroom, her past had returned in the form of a boy named Malik. The name in the case file had not triggered recognition. After all, years had passed and she had been told his adoptive family would rename him. But now, seeing him in person, hearing his voice, something deep inside her stirred with familiarity. The way he held his head when he was nervous, the intensity in his eyes, the shape of his smile. Each detail was like a key unlocking a door she had long closed. She tried to tell herself it was coincidence, that Malik's words were born of longing rather than truth, but her heart refused to believe it. There was a pull, undeniable and powerful, that tied her to this boy in a way she could not explain. As the proceedings continued, Elena found herself drifting into memories. She remembered the day she signed the papers, the way the social worker avoided her eyes as she handed over the forms. She remembered the sound of her son's cry as he was carried away, a sound that haunted her even now. She remembered standing outside the agency afterward, the world moving around her as if nothing had happened, while her own world had crumbled in silence. The years that followed had been filled with achievements, but the cost had always lingered beneath the surface. She had never married, never had other children, telling herself she was too focused on her career. But in truth, she had never forgiven herself. She had lived with the shadow of her choice, building walls around her heart so no one could see the wound that never healed. Now that wound had been reopened in front of an entire courtroom. And worse, it was not just her past, it was Malik's present. This boy, standing with trembling hands and brave eyes, was claiming her as his mother. Whether by fate, coincidence, or some divine hand, the truth she had buried had found its way back to her. Elena struggled to maintain her composure. She listened to the attorneys, she asked the necessary questions, but her voice lacked its usual firmness. She could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her, sensing the tension, the shift in her normally steady demeanor. Inside, she was unraveling. Could it be him? She asked herself over and over. Could Malik be the son I gave away? Her logical mind demanded proof. She knew that feelings, dreams, and coincidences were not evidence. She needed facts, records, DNA tests, and yet her heart whispered what her mind refused to admit she already knew. In the depths of her soul, she recognized him. The boy she had carried, the boy she had released into the world with tears in her eyes, had returned to her courtroom years later, calling her by the name she had longed to hear, Mom. The weight of it pressed heavily on her chest. How could she continue this case? How could she separate herself from the truth that had just been laid bare? Yet she had no choice. She was a judge. Her duty was to the law, not to her personal life. Still, no matter how she tried to steady her breathing, no matter how she forced herself to focus on procedure, she could not silence the pounding of her heart or the flood of memories crashing against the wall she had built. For the first time in her career, Judge Elena Carter doubted her ability to remain impartial. For the first time, she wondered if the law could make space for something larger than rules and evidence, something as fragile and powerful as love. The shocking moment. The courtroom, usually a place of solemn order, had erupted into a storm of whispers and gasps after Malik's bold declaration. The boy's small voice, steady yet trembling, had carried a weight that shattered the invisible barrier between authority and vulnerability, between the present and the past. "You're my mom." Those words floated in the air like smoke, impossible to catch, impossible to erase. Every person in the room felt the shift, as though history itself had bent, and no one knew how to straighten it again. On the benches behind Malik, people leaned forward, eyes wide with disbelief, hands covering mouths to stifle exclamations. Some shook their heads, muttering that the boy must be confused, that such a thing was impossible. Others whispered with suspicion, their voices carrying questions of scandal and hidden truths. The attorneys exchanged quick, uneasy glances, each silently calculating how to respond without losing control of the hearing. The social worker, Ms. Jennings, bent low to Malik, her hand hovering near his shoulder, torn between comforting him and silencing him. Mrs. Miller, his foster guardian, sat frozen, her eyes darting from Malik to the judge, her face pale as though she had just seen a ghost. Judge Elena Carter sat higher than them all, yet she felt more exposed than anyone in the room. The gavel in her hand was heavy, but not as heavy as the pounding of her heart. She wanted to strike it against the bench to call for silence, to restore order with the authority she had spent years mastering. But her hand would not move. Instead, she stared at the boy, at Malik, whose eyes had locked with hers as if they were tied by an invisible thread. Her throat tightened. She had trained herself to face angry lawyers, desperate defendants, and hostile crowds without so much as a flicker of emotion. Yet here, before a child, she felt utterly defenseless. It was not just his words. It was the certainty with which he spoke them. He had not asked if she was his mother. He had declared it. And in that declaration, something deep inside her shifted, a part of her that she had buried long ago, pushing its way back into the light. The silence stretched, broken only by the restless shuffling of the crowd. Finally, the prosecutor cleared his throat, his voice uneasy. "Your Honor, I must object to this outburst. The child is clearly mistaken, and this has no bearing on the matter at hand." But his words were drowned by the low rumble of the audience, their curiosity now growing into a tide of speculation. Someone whispered loudly enough to be heard, "He looks like her, doesn't he?" Another voice followed quickly. "Maybe there's more to this story than we know." Judge Carter's grip tightened on the bench. Her professional instincts screamed at her to intervene, to shut it down, to bring the focus back to the adoption case. But another voice, quieter, older, more fragile, rose from deep within her. The voice of a young woman who had once held a baby in trembling arms, who had once signed papers with tears streaming down her cheeks. That voice whispered, "Don't silence him. Listen." Malik, still standing, seemed smaller than ever, yet his courage held. His chest rose and fell rapidly, but his eyes never wavered. He had spoken his truth, and though the room buzzed with disbelief, he stood tall in the face of it. "I know it sounds strange," he continued, his voice cracking slightly but gaining strength. "But I feel it. I feel it here." He placed his small hand over his heart. "When I look at you, I feel like I've known you forever. Like you're the person I've been waiting for." The words cut through the murmurs, silencing them for a moment. It was no longer just a courtroom. It was a stage for something much greater than law, a revelation of the human heart. Judge Carter inhaled sharply, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to deny it immediately, to protect both herself and the boy from the scandal such a claim could ignite. But when she looked at him, truly looked, the denial caught in her throat. His eyes, wide and searching, mirrored her own from decades past. His jawline, the curve of his nose, even the way he held his shoulders. It was as if she were looking into a reflection of a life she had tried to forget. The courtroom erupted again, this time louder, as reporters scribbled furiously and families whispered theories. The bailiff stepped forward, his booming voice demanding quiet. But the energy in the room refused to die down. Elena finally raised her gavel, her hand trembling slightly, and struck it against the wood. The sharp crack echoed like a thunderclap, and silence reluctantly returned. "This court," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "will maintain order. Any further disruptions will not be tolerated. She paused, her gaze sweeping the room before returning to Malik. Her tone softened, almost imperceptibly. Malik, I understand that you are emotional, but such claims are serious. Do you understand what you are saying? Yes, Malik replied firmly. His voice, though young, carried the weight of truth. I know you're my mom. The words struck Elena like a second blow, and for a heartbeat her carefully constructed world cracked further. She wanted to demand proof, to remind him that memories could be unreliable, that longing could create illusions, but deep down she could not bring herself to say it. Because what if he was right? What if fate, cruel and strange, had brought her own son into her courtroom after all these years? The attorney shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to proceed. The social worker, her face pale, asked permission to approach the bench. Your Honor, she said quietly, perhaps we should take a recess. The child may be overwhelmed. Elena nodded slowly, grateful for the suggestion, though her insides churned with conflict. She struck the gavel again. This court will take a short recess, she announced. 15 minutes. The crowd erupted into motion, conversations buzzing, reporters whispering, families speculating. Malik remained where he stood, his eyes still fixed on Elena, as though afraid that if he looked away she might vanish. Elena rose from the bench, her robe heavy on her shoulders, and stepped through the side door into her chambers. The door closed behind her, shutting out the noise of the courtroom. But the silence inside was no relief. She sank into her chair, her hands trembling as they rested on the desk. Her reflection in the small mirror on the wall caught her eye. She hardly recognized herself. Her face pale, her eyes wide, her lips pressed tightly together to keep from quivering. For years she had worn the mask of composure, and now, with a single sentence from a child, the mask had cracked. Her mind replayed Malik's words again and again. You're my mom. They were impossible yet undeniable. Could it be true? Could the boy standing in her courtroom be the same infant she had once held? The same child she had given away in a moment of weakness and despair? The thought made her chest ache, her throat tighten with emotions she had long suppressed. She remembered that day again. The papers, the pen, the cry. She remembered promising herself she was doing the right thing, even as her heart screamed otherwise. And now, years later, the past had walked back into her life, not quietly but loudly, in front of an entire courtroom. Her hand brushed against her desk, where the case file lay open. She stared at the name, Malik Johnson. Her eyes scanned the details she had read before, details that now seemed far more significant. Date of birth, place of birth, circumstances of entry into the foster system. Each word pulled her deeper into the truth she had tried so hard to deny. The timing fit, the details fit, and when she thought of his face, his voice, his certainty, it was almost unbearable. For the first time in decades, Judge Elena Carter felt tears sting her eyes. She pressed her hand against her mouth, silencing the sob that threatened to escape. She had spent years convincing herself she was strong, unbreakable, untouchable, but no wall could withstand the truth of a child's voice calling her what she had longed, in secret, to be called Mom. The inspirational resolution when the recess ended. The atmosphere in the courtroom was unlike anything it had ever held before. The spectators filed back to their seats, their voices buzzing like restless bees, every eye bright with curiosity, every ear straining for what would come next. The bailiff called for silence, but it was not silence that filled the air. It was anticipation, thick and electric, as though the room itself was holding its breath. The gavel struck once, sharp and commanding, and Judge Elena Carter returned to her bench. But though she looked composed, her insides were anything but. Her eyes swept over the room, landing for only a moment on Malik, who sat quietly now, his legs still swinging slightly from the bench. His eyes, dark and steady, did not wander. They held hers as though they belonged to her. And in that gaze, Elena saw not just the boy before her, but the baby she once held, the child she once lost, and the man he could yet become. She cleared her throat. Her voice, when it came, was calm, but there was a softness in it that had not been there before. This court recognizes that serious claims have been made during these proceedings. It is the duty of this court to ensure the truth is established, not only for the integrity of the law, but for the well-being of the child. She paused, drawing a slow breath. Therefore, the court orders a DNA test to confirm or disprove the claim made by Malik Johnson. Until then, the matter of adoption will remain on hold. Gasps and murmurs swept through the room again. Reporters scribbled furiously. The attorneys nodded stiffly, though both were clearly unsettled. Miss Jennings, the social worker, exhaled deeply as if she had been waiting for such an order, and Mrs. Miller placed a steadying hand on Malik's back. But Malik, hearing the decision, did not flinch. Instead, he nodded as though he had expected it all along. His face carried no fear, only certainty. He had spoken the truth of his heart, and now the world would have to catch up. Days turned into weeks as the test was arranged. Malik waited patiently, though in his heart he already knew. Judge Carter waited too, though for her the days were restless, filled with a flood of emotions she had long forgotten how to carry. At night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, memories pressing in on her from every side. She remembered her son's first cry, his tiny fingers gripping hers, the way she had kissed his forehead before letting him go. She remembered the weight of guilt, the loneliness of success without family, the endless years of pretending that the choice had not scarred her. And now she remembered Malik's eyes, his voice, the way he stood in her courtroom with a courage beyond his years. When the results finally came, the envelope sat on her desk for a long time before she had the strength to open it. Her chambers were quiet, the walls lined with books of law and cases she had presided over, but at that moment, none of those mattered. All that mattered was the single truth hidden inside that envelope. Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal, her breath catching in her throat as she pulled out the papers. The words were clinical, written in the detached language of science, but to her they were louder than any gavel strike. Probability of maternity, 99.9%. Her knees weakened and she sank into her chair. For a long time she simply stared at the words, her chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. The truth was undeniable. Malik was her son. The boy she had lost, the boy she had mourned, the boy she had believed gone forever. He had found his way back to her. Tears spilled over, hot and relentless. For years she had hidden from this pain, and now it poured out of her in waves, unstoppable. But beneath the grief there was something else, something fierce and unshakable. It was love. Love that had been buried but not destroyed. Love that had survived distance and time and silence. Love that had returned to claim its place. The next hearing was unlike any other. The courtroom was packed, the tension almost unbearable, but this time Elena felt no fear. She entered with the weight of truth on her shoulders, but also with a strength she had not felt in decades. She took her seat, raised her gavel, and brought the room to silence. After reviewing the evidence, she said, her voice clear and unwavering, "This court confirms that Malik Johnson is, by DNA verification, my biological son." When the session ended, Elena descended from her bench, something she rarely did, and walked slowly toward Malik. The room watched in silence, breaths held as she stopped before him. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Then, with a trembling hand, Elena reached out, brushing a curl from his forehead. Malik's eyes closed at the touch, a soft sigh escaping his lips, as though he had been waiting for that gesture his whole life. "My son," Elena whispered, her voice breaking. "Mom," Malik whispered back, his small arms wrapping tightly around her waist. The courtroom erupted, not with scandal, not with whispers, but with applause. It was not the applause of a legal victory, but of something far greater. The triumph of love over time, of family over loss, of hope over despair. From that day forward, the story of Judge Elena Carter and Malik Johnson spread far beyond the walls of that courthouse. Some spoke of it as fate, others as miracle, but for Elena and Malik it was simply the truth. The truth that love, though buried, had not died. The truth that no distance, no mistake, no passage of time could sever the bond between mother and child. Elena resigned from that case, knowing she could not remain impartial, but she did not resign from her duty as a mother. For the first time in years, she opened her home, her heart and her life to someone else. Malik, after years of drifting, finally had a place where he belonged. He no longer drew faces in his notebook, because the face he had searched for was now beside him every day. And Elena, after years of silence, finally spoke the words she had carried in her heart. "I love you, my son." Their journey was not easy. There were adjustments, challenges, and the slow healing of old wounds. But through it all there was love. Love that grew stronger with every shared meal, every conversation, every quiet evening spent together. Love that reminded them both that even the most broken past could give birth to a hopeful future. And so, the story of a boy who looked at a judge and said, "You're my mom," became not just a moment of shock in a courtroom, but a testament to resilience, forgiveness, and the unbreakable bond of family. It became a story that inspired others to believe in second chances, to hold on to hope, to trust that even when all seems lost, love can still find its way home.